Mr. President.
Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, the Democrats' talking points against the SAVE Act are being proven wrong day after day after day. Now, we've heard them say repeatedly, non-citizens, including illegal aliens, don't vote because they can't vote. That is to say, they don't vote because they're not allowed to vote because federal law prohibits non-citizens from voting in U.S. elections. But, Mr. President, they do. They have. And existing laws make it, unfortunately, far too easy for them to do so. In fact, Oregon officials, to cite just one example, admitted just recently an error with the state's automatic voter enrollment problem. And they acknowledged that it was much more significant an error than they previously thought, having registered 1,259 possible non-citizens just since 2021 alone. Now, some of them mistakenly enrolled non-citizens thereafter went on to cast a ballot, according to Oregon's Secretary of State. This enrollment error in Oregon was first unearthed earlier this month, with officials admitting to wrongly registering around 300 voters through an Oregon DMV program that registers legal citizens when they obtain a driver's license or a state ID. But this week, the DMV and the Secretary of State's office said a complete review showed 1,259 people who didn't provide proof of U.S. citizenship or added to Oregon's voter rolls, a number 4 times the previously acknowledged and reported figure. Now, unfortunately, Oregon is not unique in this regard. There are other states that have acknowledged problems, a long list of them, including states like Texas and Virginia, each clearing thousands of non-citizens from their existing voter registration rolls. And yet Democrats say this isn't happening. They continue to dismiss the need for the SAVE Act, citing an existing law under which non-citizens are, in fact, already barred from voting in federal elections, as well they should be. They are barred, but the fact that they're barred doesn't mean that a combination of circumstances based on existing law makes it far, far too easy for non-citizens to vote. And as I said a moment ago, they do, even though they're prohibited from doing it, and in many circumstances they have. But we're seeing it happen in real time. This is our final chance to address this issue before what I think most of us would acknowledge is going to be one of the most consequential elections of our lifetimes. If Democrats truly believe, as most Americans do, that voting in U.S. elections should be reserved for American citizens, then they must agree to pass the SAVE Act. This is not too heavy a lift. This is something that just makes it possible for us to enforce existing law. Existing law that, to my knowledge, nobody in this chamber or in the other legislative chamber down the hall has suggested we change. That's all this does. That's all the SAVE Act is about. That this is, in fact, the last chance to prove that they care about election integrity in order for it to matter in enough time that it can make a difference between now and the November general election. After all, since the Biden-Harris inauguration, over 10 million undocumented immigrants have entered the United States illegally. This figure, just that figure of 10 million who came into the country illegally in the last 3.5 years alone, that figure exceeds the population of most of our states, 36 in fact. A supermajority of all of our states have populations smaller than the population of illegal immigrants that have come through unlawfully under the Biden-Harris watch. With millions of unauthorized people on U.S. soil and a total of 30 million non-citizens living in the United States, the potential for election fraud through ineligible voting is not a hypothetical risk. This means the foundational principles that underpin our republic, or any republic for that matter, are under attack. It's under attack because President Biden, Secretary Mayorkas, and Border Czar Vice President Kamala Harris refuse to enforce the law. With the influx of illegal aliens under this administration, if even a fraction, let's just say 1 in 100, were to vote, this could translate into hundreds of thousands of votes. Depending on where they're located and concentrated, this could be far more than enough to sway many of our most tightly contested elections and alter their outcomes, even in, especially in the case of the presidential election. So make no mistake, this matters. It has consequences. And what we do or choose not to do will make a difference. This is concerning considering a recent study. And in that study, we found that non-citizens have ample openings, significant opportunities, repeatedly, to vote unlawfully. This study found that anywhere from 10 to 27% of non-citizens in the United States are, in fact, today registered to vote. And anywhere from 5% to 13% of non-citizens in the United States currently do vote in presidential elections. So no, don't tell me this doesn't happen. Don't tell me, well, it's already unlawful, so we don't need to do anything about it. We know that existing law, well, it prohibits non-citizen voting in federal elections. Existing law makes it far too easy to do, and that's what we want to do in America with our elections. We want to make it easy to vote, hard to cheat. The last thing we want to do is make it easy to vote for those who will cheat, who do cheat by virtue of their voting because they're not entitled to do it. It's what it means to be a citizen in a republic. It's what it means to be a country and to have a vote. You're stealing other people's votes. You're diluting their votes. You're in effect disenfranchising legitimate votes when you participate unlawfully, fraudulently, feloniously, but in a way that current law makes far too possible. Across the nation, instances abound where states have inadvertently, apparently, facilitated this crisis. Who knows to what degree of inadvertence this was, but it's always referred to as an inadvertent error. And unless or until we can prove otherwise, we have to deal with it. But regardless of the degree of awareness and intentionality that went into it, these things did in fact happen. Everything from unsolicited voter registration forms being mailed directly to the addresses of non-citizens, driver's licenses being issued without adequate checks, relying merely on the honesty of illegal aliens as they complete forms. All of these practices have opened up the floodgates to voter fraud. Now, there is no law in place telling the states, as they process voter registration forms under the 1993 National Voter Registration Act, or NVRA. This is the so-called motor voter law. And it's a law that allows people, when they apply for a driver's license, to simultaneously register to vote in federal elections simply by checking a box and signing their name. Nothing in the NVRA or in any other current provision of federal law tells the states exactly how or what they must do in order to verify the citizenship of voters who plan to participate in federal elections. Regrettably, a few years ago, the Supreme Court of the United States interpreted the NVRA based on the fact that it doesn't instruct the states on how to verify citizenship, as somehow prohibiting the states from asking for proof of identification, verifying citizenship at the time someone registers to vote under the NVRA in a federal election. Now, this ruling was wrong, in my opinion. It was a majority opinion of the Supreme Court. I believe they got it wrong. It's the court's ruling nonetheless, and it stands. It was issued over the strong dissent of Justice Alito, who pointed out reasons why that shouldn't have been interpreted that way. But that ruling stands nonetheless, and the states have to abide by that order. So, Mr. President, to be clear, under the law as it now stands, somebody going into a state, applying for a driver's license, as you're allowed to do, by the way, as a non-citizen in all 50 states, you can apply for a driver's license, all 50 states and the District of Columbia. if you check the box on the attached NVRA form saying you want to register to vote and then sign your name saying, yeah, I'm eligible to do this, that's it. The state isn't even allowed to ask you for any kind of identification. That's the end of the matter. A mere check on a box and a signature is all it takes, with little to no risk of being caught. In fact, non-citizens are being encouraged to vote and not warned of the consequences of doing so. The fact that the Supreme Court wrongly interpreted federal law to ban states from requiring proof of citizenship when registering voters via federal forms makes it all the more urgent and important for us to do this. This signals loudly and clearly this is how you get around this thing. We've got to fill this gap. An increasing number of localities permit non-citizens to vote in local elections. Now, that's their decision. I think it's a terrible decision on their part, but it's a decision over which we as Congress, we as the lawmaking branch of the United States government have no control. But what we do have control over is who may vote in federal elections. That part is our business. Prominent Democrats have openly discussed these tactics as beneficial to their agenda. These tactics meaning deliberately bringing about the registration to vote in federal elections by non-citizens and participating in federal elections and casting ballots unlawfully as non-citizens. Only months ago, every Senate Democrat voted to count illegal aliens in the census to help them shore up more seats in Congress and more votes in the Electoral College. This cannot continue. It's one thing to do that in the context of the decennial apportionment count, the part of the census that is used to distribute seats in Congress, in the House of Representatives, and the Electoral College. It's quite another thing to let them actually vote. No sane republic would or should do that, certainly not this republic. The American people agree overwhelmingly on this. If you're an American citizen, you can vote in federal elections. If you're not, you can't, and you shouldn't be able to. It's our responsibility, it's our imperative to close these gates that have been left wide open as a result of a combination of circumstances, including the NVRA, the wrong interpretation of it by the Supreme Court a few years ago, and then the 10 million plus illegal aliens coming in the last 3.5 years alone, and the total of 30 million plus non-citizens living in the United States today, coupled with the fact that it's never been easier to apply for a driver's license in all 50 states and the District of Columbia, even if you're a non-citizen. My bill, called the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act, or the SAVE Act, would be a vital step in securing the electoral process, ensuring that every state vote, that every vote cast must be legitimate, that every vote cast must be cast by a U.S. citizen, and every voter be duly and lawfully registered. The SAVE Act amends the National Voter Registration Act so that states can ensure that only U.S. citizens may participate in federal elections. The SAVE Act requires states to obtain concrete documentary proof of citizenship at the time of voter registration. It specifies that acceptable documentation must be provided, and it explains what kind of documentation. It also requires states to establish alternative verification processes for those rare cases where standard documents might be unavailable. And in that respect, Mr. President, the SAVE Act is far easier to comply with than other examples we can identify under existing federal law, where Americans routinely can be and are required to produce proof of citizenship in order to do a certain thing. The most common of these instances of federal law requiring proof of citizenship involves the submission of the form known as the I-9. If you're not familiar with that, I can guarantee if you're a U.S. citizen and you've ever had a job, you've filled one out. The I-9 is the form that you have to present whenever you start new employment. If you're starting as an employee, you got to fill out the I-9. Attached to the I-9 has to be a proof of citizenship. Typically, it's most easily satisfied if you have a U.S. passport. If you don't have a U.S. passport, you've got to show a U.S. birth certificate, and then I think a couple of forms of government-issued photo ID to prove that you are that person identified on that birth certificate, and then you're good. The SAVE Act is even more flexible than that. That's not too onerous by itself, but recognizing that the right to vote is at stake, and that some people might not have or might have lost some of these documents, it provides myriad other avenues by which they may prove their citizenship. This is not too onerous. It also requires the states to set up these verification processes to make sure that they can get this done. And it provides incredibly expansive ways to prove citizenship. Even if you don't have any documented proof, you can do it. This will in no way make it hard for any U.S. citizens to vote, not even the poorest or the least fastidious about record keeping among us. Every one of them will be able to vote if they are U.S. citizens. Indeed, it'll prevent their votes from being canceled by foreign actors trying to bring about what really amounts to foreign interference with U.S. elections, which is something we all claim to care about and be opposed to aggressively. Furthermore, the SAVE Act compels states to proactively remove non-citizens from voter rolls and introduces severe federal penalties for those individuals who knowingly register non-citizens to vote. The bill echoes the sentiments of the American people themselves, from coast to coast, from north to south, east to west. It transcends political affiliations and speaks directly to the core of what makes our country great: fair, free, and secure elections. Look, there's a lot that divides us here, that sets Democrats against Republicans, and that can result in us disagreeing on the basis of a genuine disagreement among our voters, among our constituents. Republicans and Democrats, voters and senators alike, often just disagree depending on our political alignment. But in this particular instance, it's the senators who are opposed to each other, not reflected in the way that the American people feel. Among the American people, this is like an 80% issue. Like 80% of Americans believe that we should be doing this. In fact, they feel like it's absolutely crazy to not do it. This is about transcending those political affiliations and going back to what's so important about being a U.S. citizen and casting our vote. Your vote doesn't mean much if it can be canceled out by somebody else who's not entitled to be there. Like, there's not a corporation in America that would allow non-shareholders to participate in a shareholder election. It wouldn't let a non-shareholder vote if the whole point of the vote was to let shareholders vote. If I were to wander into the Senate Democratic caucus as they're holding their leadership elections or any other important deliberation where they've got to vote, they wouldn't in a million years let me vote in there because I'm not a Senate Democrat. When I arrived in the United States Senate, each of the 3 times I've been sworn in as a United States Senator, I had to produce documentary proof that I had, in fact, been elected in Utah. I had to produce an election certificate issued by the chief election official in the state of Utah, the lieutenant governor, who indicated that I had won my elections, first in 2010, then in 2016, then in 2022. Without being able to prove that I was entitled to be here and to cast a vote here, I would never have been allowed to vote, nor should I be. It's no less true with U.S. elections. We cannot let those who are not entitled under the law to do it, because they're not citizens, to vote in our elections. This is about protecting our elections from foreign interference, something my Democratic colleagues claim to care immensely about. And every day we delay, the foundation of our electoral processes erodes a little more. We can't wait for this administration to enforce the law. This bill will make it harder to cheat in elections. and ensure the integrity of every single ballot that gets cast. There's really no valid argument against it. So heretofore, people opposed to it have just been either throwing out red herrings like it's already illegal, which for reasons I've explained a minute ago means nothing if there's no way to enforce the law, and the existing law makes it far too easy to cheat without getting caught, or alternatively, just ignoring it altogether. But there is no valid argument against this bill. That's why you don't hear any valid argument against this bill. It doesn't exist. The only reason to oppose this bill would be if you need and are counting on illegal votes to win elections, if you're wanting to rely on those, perhaps in the first instance or as a backup, I don't know. There is no valid, legitimate reason to oppose it. By passing the SAVE Act, we would send a clear message that in the United States, voting is not just a privilege of citizenship, but also a protected and cherished right, one that we need to protect. As debates about election integrity rage, the SAVE Act stands out by guaranteeing that only American citizens will have a say in our elections. American elections must be decided by Americans, by American citizens. Without that, without them, we have no right to be here. We have no right to pass laws on behalf of the people without those people being citizens. And so we've got to make sure that those people determining who's here, who's in the chamber down the hall, and who sits in the White House is in fact a U.S. citizen. I acknowledge the presence of my friend and colleague, the distinguished senator from Kansas.
Madam President.
The senator from Kansas.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm sure I'm honored to be here on the Senate floor fighting to defend our democratic process with my friend and colleague from the great state of Utah. Free, safe, secure, and fair elections are integral to the survival of our republic. Without election integrity, the voice of American citizens, the foundation of our republic, is at risk of being silenced. Unfortunately, millions of Americans have lost confidence in the security of our elections. They question whether their vote truly matters or if their vote is being diluted by non-citizens. We must ensure that the outcome of our elections is determined by our own citizens, uninfluenced by illegal ballots. The heart of our democracy depends upon this. Ensuring that only U.S. citizens vote in our election isn't just necessary, it's common sense. I'm proud to support the SAVE Act, which will protect our elections by requiring proof of citizenship to register to vote and an ID at the time of voting. This shouldn't be a divisive issue. Nearly 80% of Americans, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, all agree on this simple requirement, 80%. Now again, this is common sense. You need an ID to drive, you need an ID to board a plane, you need an ID to get a fishing license. But voting is a sacred right with even a higher value than those other examples. That voting should demand the same standard. Protecting this right isn't controversial, it's common sense. Now right now, due to the crisis of our open southern border, at least 11 million illegal immigrants are in the United States today. That number alone could replace the population of 36 states, almost 4 times the population of Kansas. Imagine what that could do to our electoral process if left unchecked. You know, friends back home, I just did a telephone town hall. They asked me the same question. Why do my colleagues across the aisle refuse to support a policy that 80% of Americans agree upon that would make our elections freer, safer, more secure? Well, let me tell you why. It's because they've spent years courting illegal immigrants, ushering them into our country, ushering in over 12 million, hoping to tip the scales in key states. But we cannot let them hijack our elections. Now look, non-citizen voting is real. This isn't hypothetical. In Texas, Virginia, and Oregon, non-citizens have been found on the voting rosters. Additionally, California, Maryland, Vermont, and Washington, D.C. already allow non-citizens to vote in local elections. This is an immediate threat to the future of our democracy, and it demands action. This is a nonpartisan American issue. It's about protecting our country. Just as we reject foreign interference in our elections, we must reject non-citizen voting with equal seriousness. And this is why Congress must act, and they can act today. This has already been passed on the House. We could pass this today, the President could sign it tomorrow, and away we go. With the SAVE Act, we can restore faith in our elections. We're only 40 days away from the most consequential election in our lifetime. Time's running out. Our republic depends on it. So let's act. Madam President, I'd like to yield the floor back to my colleague from Utah.
I recognize the presence of my friend and colleague, the senior senator from Tennessee.
I thank my colleague from Utah. Madam President, thank you for the time and the recognition. And I want to say thank you to him for bringing this issue forward. As I am out and about in Tennessee, I hear a lot about this. People are concerned about what would happen if those who are illegally in the country get a vote, if they exercise the rights of citizenship, because so many people in Tennessee talk about that in America there is nothing more fundamental than guarding our God-given freedoms. Approaching the ballot box as equal citizens for fair and open elections. And they're quite disturbed because for the last more than 3 years, what they have seen is the Biden-Harris administration has waged a war on this sacred institution by working overtime to make illegal immigration legal. Now, you've heard reference to the numbers of illegal aliens, and by the way, that is the statutorial term that is used about the numbers that have come into this country. We know it is north of 10 million illegal aliens. The senator from Kansas referenced this, and the size, larger, the number, the population number, larger than 36 of our states, and the impact that that can have. And as my colleague from Utah pointed out, when someone comes here illegally and they go into a state like Minnesota that gives those that are illegally in the country a driver's license, and then that individual goes to another state, through the motor voter law, they can check that box and they can register to vote. They can get that driver's license. They can register to vote. And we know that this has occurred, and we have seen it occur in voter rolls all across this country, Massachusetts to Arizona, and everywhere in between. Now, recently, the state of Virginia went through their voter rolls, and they discovered that they had more than 6,000 that were on their voter rolls who had entered the country illegally. And this becomes such a problem when you look at the number of states that do not require voter ID when they vote. We've got 14 states across this country where you do not have to show an ID when you go to vote at the polls. You just show up and you vote. Now, one thing is clear. While it's against the law for illegal aliens to vote in federal elections, many states and jurisdictions lack the proper safeguards to enforce this law. It's already illegal. It's already illegal. But they broke the law coming in the country illegally. They've broken the law by checking that box and registering to vote. And the risk is higher than ever because of what has transpired at the open border. But the SAVE Act, which the gentleman from Utah has brought to the floor today, would solve this problem because it would require proof of U.S. citizenship to vote in an election. And you would have to provide that proof in person. I will tell you, Madam President, there are many people that are surprised that we don't require that proof, that you prove that you are who you say you are. The SAVE Act also has provisions to restore our election integrity. It would require states to establish a program to remove those that are illegally in the country from the voter rolls, and it would also allow citizens to sue election officials who fail to uphold requirements for proof of citizenship. Now, the House did pass this in July, and it has been sitting over here for the last couple of months. And so I would ask my Democratic colleagues, what in this bill do you oppose? What do you oppose? Why is it that you would want to open the door to allow individuals that have illegally entered the country to actually vote in a federal election? Do you want to encourage them to vote in our elections? This is why we need to protect the integrity of each citizen, each person, one, one vote. Now, my colleague from North Carolina has also come to the floor, and I want to say a word about his Promoting Free and Fair Elections Act, which would also be helpful. His bill, which I support, would block President Biden's executive order that forces, not allows, but commands. It forces federal agencies to work with outside partisan groups to mobilize voters. And guess what? The taxpayers got to pay for this. Talk about wanting to federalize elections. Talk about the federal government wanting to throw their weight. This is it. And of course, the executive order excludes any information about how the Biden-Harris administration would go about approving or selecting groups. So I commend my colleague from North Carolina for the Promoting Free and Fair Elections Act. I commend my colleague from Utah for the SAVE Act, and I yield the balance of my time to my colleague from Utah.
Thank you. Madam President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to immediate consideration of counter number 439, H.R. 8281, the SAVE Act. Further, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object.
The senator from California.
Reserving the right to object, Madam President. Today marks the third time three times. Madam President, in this particular case, the third time is not the charm. But I grant my colleague one thing. He says that things have changed since the last time he tried to bring this bill up for a vote or approval on unanimous consent. What's changed, you might ask? Well, this bill actually failed to pass the Republican-controlled House of Representatives just last week. Republicans attached this bill to a must-pass government funding bill, and they still couldn't find the votes, not even with the votes that they have on their side of the aisle. So it does beg the question, what the heck are we doing here? This is not a serious attempt to protect our elections. The only thing that this bill does, and the discussion of it does, is risk stoking fear that our elections may not be secure, and it creates mistrust in the outcome of elections. So I feel compelled to take a moment to once again reassure all Americans that are listening today. There is no credible evidence of massive voter fraud or massive number of non-citizens voting in our elections. No evidence, none. Let me be clear, no evidence, none. In fact, it is already illegal for non-citizens to vote in federal elections, no matter what state they live in. And some of the conversation from some of the senators over the last several minutes, there's been reference to what the federal government may be doing to federalize elections. I will make specific reference to the motor voter law that was approved by Congress on a bipartisan basis that, yes, directs states to do what they can to encourage civic participation and to utilize their Department of Motor Vehicles to engage eligible voters. Since they're already interfacing with government, let's take that moment of their time, as they're already sharing name, address, date of birth, other personal information, and in addition to applying for a driver's license or a state ID, if they're eligible, to register them to vote in the process or update their registration. And yes, there are states in the country that do allow a non-citizen or an undocumented immigrant even to obtain a driver's license, but I can tell you, as a former chief elections officer for the state of California, not just on behalf of California, but my colleagues across the country that I've worked with, protocols are in place. If you're a non-citizen applying for a special type of driver's license, or an undocumented immigrant applying for a special type of driver's license, you go through one process. If you're a citizen, you go through another that includes that opportunity to register and vote. Let me come back to the bottom line here again. No evidence of massive voter fraud. No evidence the last time this bill came up, no evidence today, and I doubt there will be any evidence between now and November 5th or even after November 5th because of the integrity of election administration in the country. Now, I have to speak to the timing. We stand here today 41 days before this November's election. Election is already happening. For those who are familiar, ballots have already been mailed out to members of the military and other overseas voters. In many states, the vote by mail ballot process has already begun. In some states, early voting is beginning. The election is happening. But again, I sense the real motive for bringing this bill up today is an attempt to continue to inject fear and uncertainty in the minds of voters at a time where, frankly, we need calm, we need understanding, we need truth. So as I have in the previous objections, I'll extend my invitation again today. Let's work together in a thoughtful, responsible, bipartisan manner to ensure more eligible Americans can easily register to vote, stay registered to vote, and cast their ballots. But until I'm taken up on that offer, Madam President, I object.
Objection is heard. The senior senator from Utah.
Madam President, my distinguished friend and colleague, the senator from California, makes an impassioned plea that we not pass this bill. I appreciate his thoughtfulness and the care and consideration that he routinely gives to matters pending before the Senate. I wish I could say that always translates into accurate statements. Today it didn't. He's made several statements that are just not accurate. First and foremost, he suggested, not just suggested, he said that this bill, the SAVE Act, which I'm trying to pass right here, right now, that it failed to pass in the House of Representatives, that even in the Republican-controlled House of Representatives, it couldn't get the votes to pass. That is not true. It's 100% false. In fact, this has passed the House of Representatives. It passed the House of Representatives not only with the Republicans voting for it, but they picked up 5 Democrats along the way. So they passed it. They passed it with a bipartisan vote. Now, he may be referring to the fact that there was another vote cast last week in which they attached the SAVE Act to a spending bill. It was the spending bill that caused the combined measure to fail. But in fact, the SAVE Act has been passed by the House of Representatives. It was passed with a bipartisan vote. You see, because even these Democrats who joined with all the Republicans over in the House of Representatives acknowledge that this is a problem. The problem has been created by a combination of federal laws that have grown too loose, that have been further loosened by the Supreme Court of the United States and its interpretation of it, and that the need for it has in fact escalated. Point number two that he makes, that this is the third time, sounding, I think, a little frustrated at the fact that we've tried to do this multiple times. Well, forgive me. But the case for it has continued to build. It's continued to build steadily, even at the same time that the House of Representatives has now passed it. This does matter. So he's mistaken here in that nothing has changed. He says that there's no evidence of this. That's not true. I mean, that's news to me, given that the world learned yesterday of this evidence that just came out from the Secretary of State's office in Oregon, showing that complete review revealed 1,259 people in that state who didn't provide proof of U.S. citizenship, and they had been added to Oregon's voter registration rolls, a number 4 times the previously reported figure. That's also news to states like Texas and Virginia, just to state a couple. There are more that have been going through their voter registration rolls and discovered a lot of non-citizens. I mean, you add them all up, and we're talking about thousands of non-citizens registering to vote. So then he pivots a little bit, and he says there's no evidence of massive voter fraud. If thousands of illegally registered voters, people who illegally registered to vote in federal elections, if that's not massive, I don't know what is. Now, as to the next point that he makes, ballots have already been mailed out. I don't dispute that. I'm absolutely certain that that is the case. That is in no way, shape, or form an argument against the SAVE Act, nor is it an argument against passing this now. In fact, there's no reason not to pass this now. There's good reason to pass it now, given that in fully 22 states in the United States of America, fully 22 states allow voter registration up to and including the day of the presidential election. So in addition to the thousands of persons who are non-citizens and therefore may not lawfully register to vote or vote in a federal election, who have already registered to vote, many of whom have been shown in past elections to have voted illegally. We don't even know what the total number is. We don't even know what the total number of people who might register to vote and then vote unlawfully between now and the 5th of November, when the general election is held. Then in addition to the 22 states where you can register to vote up to and including the day of the presidential election, there are a whole lot of others that allow it to varying degrees at some point between now and Election Day. Then he goes back to the fact that this is not a serious proposal. I don't know what that means, other than Democrats don't like it, and I understand that they don't like it. It is serious. I assure you, Madam President, and I assure my colleagues, this is a very serious matter. When people register to vote and vote illegally, that disenfranchises actual U.S. citizens. Finally, Madam President, I do take exception to something. Take exception to the suggestion as to motive, suggesting that the reason I'm here to do this is to disingenuously plow what he refers to as, quote, fear and uncertainty as to the legitimacy of our elections. Not only is this kind of speech uncalled for and prohibited under Rule 19 of the Senate rules, where we're not supposed to characterize somebody's motive as something devious like this. If I were out here deliberately trying, just for kicks and giggles, to undermine the legitimacy and the outcome of the election, that would be inappropriate. That is not accurate. There's not a scintilla of proof for that. And there's a mountain of proof that we have darn good reason to bring this about. I am deeply disappointed, Madam President, that we can't pass this. This is not a heavy lift. It is not too much to ask that we put something in place, putting teeth into existing law that's been on the books for decades, that Americans overwhelmingly agree with, that says you can't vote in a U.S. election unless you're a U.S. citizen. The House passed it. We could pass it today. This could make a difference. We should pass it. It's inexcusable that we're not. Thank you, Madam President.